A really cool tree we can create for winter scenes is one covered in icicles. And now what we need to do is model our icicles first before we can apply them to our tree and make that object. So if you're using another program, whether you're using Maya or 3ds Max, Modo, anything like that for modeling, it's usually better to use that program and kind of import into Vue for this. But if not, we can also use Vue to use metablobs and create our icicle. First though, I'm just going to switch over to Lightwave's modeler, and we're just going to take a look at a way we can create a very simple object to create this effect. And then we'll be able to import that in or use just a native Vue object. And I'm just using Lightwave Modeler version 9.3. And now this is the basic principle for any program, just for creating this object. And what I want to do is just start with a basic box. That's just something really simple. And select our polygons on the bottom. Or just the one polygon on the bottom. And just bevel it out. And now in Lightwave I'm just using the B key on the keyboard, or the bevel tool, and just pulling out a section and then right mouse clicking and making another one. And now I can hit spacebar to clear out the tool, hit H on the keyboard for the stretch tool, just to model out this basic icicle shape. And whether or not you want it to be a long skinny icicle or a thicker one is really up to you. One of the best ways to do this is to create sort of a variation in different sizes, but depending on the way you're adding them to your tree, that can cause some problems, and we'll take a look at that in a little bit. But what we want to do is just Shift D to metaform this, basically making a sub D surface and increasing our polygon level. And now what we can do is go in and just edit our points a little, and I'm going to just select some of these areas and use the rotate tool just to modify them and give a little variation to our object. And we'll go ahead and move those top points down. And then what we can also do is select some of these points and kind of add some bends within our object, just to make it a little more realistic and a little more interesting. And I also want to go down to that bottom set of points and just grab that point on the bottom and just move that in so it's not a really sharp point. And now this is a very low poly model that we have, which is going to work really well for this because we don't want to have an extremely high polygon model. Hit W on the keyboard, we can take a look at our polygon count. We have 82 polygons, which is going to be really easy to work with and is going to render much quicker. And I'm just going to make a few more modifications, just stretching some of these points out, because the way I modeled that first box, it was really more of a rectangular shape, and that has altered kind of the way it looks in the even flow of this icicle. We can also go to our modify for this and use the twist tool and just kind of twist these polys around, and it'll give us a really neat looking effect. So that's a really quick way to model this. If you want to use it for your scene, you can go ahead and save it and then import that in, and we'll take a look at that in a minute. But first we're going to model an icicle within Vue and take a look at ways we can do a really quick model and achieve sort of the same effect. and also take a look at how we can reduce that polygon size. And now I've switched back to view, and we're just going to model this icicle directly within view. And the first thing I'm going to do is just add in a sphere. We'll go ahead and scale that down using the scale gizmo, which is our bottom square on the right. And we're just using the global coordinates, which we have the G selected. We can also use local. And we might be switching back and forth when we're focusing on kind of editing these a little bit more. But I'm just going to start out with this first sphere. Control C and then Control V on the keyboard to copy and paste, and just kind of move that down, scale it, give a little bit of offset on the other axes, copy and paste. And now we don't need to switch to the move gizmo if we are selecting the actual object and not using the axes, and that can be a little bit quicker sometimes. Because if we still want to be able to scale it and move it, that way we don't have to switch between our gizmos. Just going to copy and paste that again, stretch that out, copy and paste, scale that down, give a little bit of an offset, copy paste once again, move that, scale it down, and I'll just make one more copy that I'm going to scale down just a little bit more and kind of move that to the end to make the tip. And now what we can do is use a metablob object in order to really round this out and make it look more realistic. What we could also do is add small spheres inside of our icicle to add a little more variation, some bumps and ridges. But we'll just take a look, see how this is going to turn out. Select all of our spheres in our layer. Start out by selecting the first sphere just by clicking on it, and then hold down the Shift key and select our last sphere to have all of those spheres selected. Go over to the left and we have our little metablob icon. Go ahead and click on that. And now we can see a rounded version of our icicle, and it's blended a little bit better. I'm going to move this up a little higher into the scene, switch to our full camera view, and now it might be rounding this out a little bit too more, not enough variation, so what we can do is reduce our intensity and the envelope distance on our metablob. And that way we conform to more of the shape we were working with. And if we take a look at the top, we can see the way that is creating a point. Now if we want that to be rounded, which is really going to work out better for what we're working on here, we're going to need to add one more sphere. So we'll open up and expand our metablob, select our first sphere, we can copy and paste it, and now make it a little bit larger and scale it down to more of a sphere shape, put that on top, and then we can drag that into our layer. And I'm just going to scale that a little bit more because we just want to round off that top, and we don't want to make it kind of bulging out as it is, so we can pull that down. And now that looks pretty good. So now we have a little icicle we can use. We can modify these spheres a little bit more, kind of move them around to adjust our shape until we have it the way we want it to look. We could also rotate these a little bit. Off to the side. And that'll also create some nice variations. And then adjust our envelope distances and things like that in order to really finalize the shape. And if we need to, we can stretch down the entire object to finalize it. So now I think this is something that we can definitely use. And what I want to do is bake this to polygons, because we don't want to have a metablob object as our final object. So once we're satisfied with the overall shape, we can right mouse click and select Bake to Polygons. And now we can set our quality and the overall amount of polygons that we want to have with the final object. And I want to bring this down really low, and the preview that we have right now of the estimated number of polygons isn't going to be exact. It's just a really rough estimate, but it gives us a good idea of where we're at. And now if we remember that one we modeled in Lightwave, that was about 100 polygons. So we can bring this down to around 100 or so, really to get kind of the same quality, because we know that looked good. And if we wanted to increase that quality, we can just drag our quality up a little bit higher from the low to the high value. I'm going to click OK. And now we can take a look at our final object, and we can see that maybe the polygon level is a little low. So we can undo that bake, right mouse click, bake to polygons, increase that just a little and click OK. And now take a look at that overall polygon amount, and we can see in the lower right corner that we have 770 polygons. That might be a little high, so we can undo that again, and really you just want to kind of play around with it until you get a good value. And we can see we're still at 770, so sometimes it can be a little touchy. Really, no matter how you adjust that setting, because it does take big gaps in order to make changes with some of these simpler objects. Now we have 158 polys, maybe not enough definition on the bottom, so we'll just go back to a higher value. And we can definitely work with that within View. It's not going to cause any major problems. But now we have this metablob finalized as an object, so it's no longer broken up into pieces. What we could do is stretch this out if we wanted to make it a little longer, and kind of scale that down, really make any modifications that you want to the overall shape once it's baked. But I'm going to change our name now to Icicle, and what we want to do is create our material. What we can also do is import in that other object that we had created in Lightwave, and I am going to change the name because I did name that other object Icicle. So I'm going to call this Icicle Meta, so that we know this is the one we created within View. And now to import in that other object and get it into View, we can go to File, Import Object, and we can select the folder that it was located in, and we have the file name Icicle, and I'm going to click Open. And now we have a couple of different options here. We can resize the object depending on the overall scale that we created it in the other program, because of course the scales and the ratios will change between different programs. You might need to scale it down, scale it up, and it can really kind of depend on which file type you're importing. We're using the LWO format, although I could go back into Lightwave and export as a 3DS and other formats. So I'm going to select the resize, manual resizing, just the default values, and click OK. And now we can take a look and see our low poly object that we had created within Lightwave. And let's go ahead and just render this out so we can take a look just with our basic materials that we have on here right now and get an idea for the shapes of how these look. So we can see the view object, because it is a much higher polygon count, looks a little bit smoother, a little bit better, but whether or not you actually need that resolution is really up to you, and of course how close you're going to be to this tree that we're going to end up creating. But now we have our two objects in here. I'm going to take our meta blob and just scale it down. Undo. And cut it. I'm going to go ahead and just scale that to match in with our imported object, just roughly the same size. So now we want to take a look and edit our material. And we'll start out by selecting our view object, and we'll double click on our material preview to open up the advanced material editor. If you're in the basic material editor, which looks like this, just go up to the top and select advanced material, because we're going to be using a lot of these different settings available in the advanced material editor that are not available in the basic material editor. I'm going to change the name to Icicle. And now what we can do is modify our color first. So in the color and alpha tab, I'm going to right mouse click on this color box, go to edit color map, and then for our current color we can select that, and I just want to give us a little bit of a light blue. Click OK. And now we can go over to the transparency, and we'll give ourselves a global transparency. And we'll increase that to kind of a higher amount. And we want to set our refraction index to 1.31, which is approximately ice. Technically it is 309, so we could also type in that value, but 3.1 will be close enough. For our reflections, we just want to give a little bit of a reflection. We're going to go back to that transparency, tone that down a bit, and we'll take a look at our object so far, and we're going to need to add in a little bit of a bump map onto it. But I'm going to go ahead and change our render settings and our aspect ratio to 16 by 9, and that way we can see both of our icicles. Increase our render size, and go ahead and render a frame of that, just so we can see what it looks like so far, and kind of get an idea throughout the process of how it's going to turn out. Our anti-aliasing quality right now is really low, so we see some jagged edges, and we'll of course be increasing that with final renders. Right now this is just want to preview what it's going to look like. It's a little too smooth, we can see, so let's go ahead and add in our bump first. Select our bump tab after going into the advanced material editor. Right mouse click, go to edit function. Let's go ahead and set up just a really simple bump map for this, just to give us nice little ridges, something more realistic. We're going to add in a noise node, which is going to allow us to render much quicker than we were using a fractal node. If you need the extra detail of a fractal, you can of course change to that type of noise setting, but really we want a faster render, and we're going to have a lot of these different objects in here, so we're just going to use a noise node. Right now we have Perlin noises value. We might want to change that. First, let's just take a look at what we have with the default noise, and it looks like we're going to need to change the scale, edit our function, and I'm just going to scale this down to a scale of around 5. And let's go ahead and just render this out. Now we can see our surface is really stretched out. So what we need to do is change this from object parametric to object standard. And the reason for that is the parametric mode we'll take in our transformations we've made to our object. And since we've kind of stretched this out a bit on the z-axis up and down, it is going to stretch out a material. If we change this to standard mode, our material will show up the way we have our settings set to tell it to. And we can see that looks a little bit better now after that's rendered, and we don't have that overall stretching. So we'll go ahead and we're going to need to modify this a little bit more. We'll increase the scale of that fractal, or that noise node, edit our material, edit function. We'll just go ahead and increase that to around 8. And I'm also going to take the chance now to go into our highlights and add our shininess onto it, because we do want some specular values. And really, depending on the type of icicle you want, if it's older ice, you would want a duller setting, and of course you would want to reduce the transparency as well, because it would become a little more brittle and less transparent as it gets older. But if it's a fresh icicle, it'll be nice and clear with a shinier setting. Let's go ahead and render that. And that looks pretty good. It looks like we have a nice looking icicle, something that's realistically calculated. If we need to, we can adjust that bump setting, either increase the overall depth, but overall that looks pretty good. So I'm going to go ahead and just close this out, our render window, go to our material, right mouse click, copy that material, and paste it onto our imported object. And we can go ahead and render this out so we can see both of these objects next to each other. And really the differences between our polygon levels. Now with an object like this, it's transparent mostly, and we're not really going to be this close to our icicles for the most part. So that low poly version really looks quite good, and whether or not you need the view object is entirely up to you. If we need to make more modifications to the bumpiness, we can easily do that. If you want to stretch it out a little, you can increase the scale on the z-axis, but I think that looks pretty good for right now. I am going to render out a higher quality version of this. And we'll just switch this to the broadcast mode. And we're just sticking with all of the defaults for that. And go ahead and render that out. And that looks pretty good. And if we also want to get an idea of how it's going to look from farther away, we can just go ahead and move our camera out a little bit and re-render. And now we can see that showing up. If we want to make these a little bit whiter, we can do that. But let's take a look and change our atmosphere a little bit to kind of reflect what it would look like kind of during the winter. So we're going to go up to our atmosphere editor, adjust our pitch, change our light setting to a lot more of the ambient setting, because during the winter we're going to have a lot more cloud cover, and we're really going to be working with more ambient light, and that is going to affect the way our material looks. Increase our sky dome lighting gain, and then in sky fog and haze I'm going to increase our haze density a little. We could adjust the color, also increase our fog, and then our glow intensity a little to give us more of a whiter, duller, drab sky. We'll go ahead and render out another frame. And we can see that maybe these icicles are a little bit too blue, and we should have them a little whiter. So I'm going to go into our icicle meta and change our color just the way we did before, but move it closer to the white, and also make sure we're in the light blue area between the green and not very close to our reds and purples. And then we can copy this material and paste it to our other object. Render another frame, and of course if we need to, we can decrease the amount of transparency we have, maybe even add another layer on top to kind of simulate snow on our icicle. But overall, I think this looks pretty good. So we're going to stick with this. And what we need to do before we can add this to any tree as part of an ecosystem and kind of have them falling down off the trees and growing on the branches, we need to save out these objects. So first we want to make sure that, once again, we have that object standard. Now we don't want to be using a world setting because our ecosystem will control the scale of our object. And we're going to end up with much smaller icicles than we have right now. These objects are actually about the size of a normal tree. So if I had a world mapping mode, once those icicles shrink down, it's only going to be a very small portion of this material. So we want to make sure we have that object standard mode. We're going to select our object, and then we can go to File, and then Save Object. And we want to save this as a VOB file, which is our view object file. I'm going to just turn on Incorporate Texture Maps and Compress File. Even though we don't have any outside texture maps that we would need to use this option with, if you did, or you were using any combination of those different texturing methods, you would want to have those turned on. And I'm just going to type in a little description. An icicle made with metablobs. And then we can go ahead and save that out. And click OK. And now select our imported object, because we also want to save this now as a VOB file. So we do the same thing we just did before, save object, and now we have icicle. And an icicle modeled in LW so that we know which is which, because we do want to compare the two. And now we can save those out. I'm also going to save this current scene we have so that we can always go back and modify our materials and save these out. And now we want to create our new scene to add in our trees. What we could do is either go to create a new scene, or what I'm actually going to do is just delete our icicles from this scene because we already have the sky set up. And what I could do is just save out our atmosphere and load in a new scene. But since we already kind of have this made up, I'm just going to stick with what we have, and then we can modify it. You just want to make sure you save out a new version of your scene using the Save As option, and that we can still go back to the scene we were just working on. So now we need to select the tree that we want to use to add these icicles to. And there are ways where we can actually just basically use any tree that's available, because we can always remove those leaves. And I can show you how to do that. We have the maple tree. What's going to work best in this case is our large dead tree, because we already have a leafless tree, and that could really end up working out the best. We could also use the dead tree to give us a really neat looking effect, and there's a lot of surface area on our branches. But first let me just show you how we can do this and remove the leaves of one of our leaf covered trees. So I'll just select our maple tree, click OK, and now there's two ways of doing this, or one major way to modify our surface, and then another way to kind of edit our OpenGL. First thing I want to do is go to our maple tree material for our leaves, and basically we just want to kind of clear this out and make an entirely transparent surface. So what I can do is go to our transparency, and under the variable transparency I'll just go ahead and turn that off, and now global transparency is set to 100%. I can also turn off cast and receive shadows, turn off indirect lighting, anti-aliasing, and that'll help speed up anything that we have affecting this object, because now we have a transparent object in the scene, and that could sometimes interfere with our overall renders. Let's take a look at a quick render of what we have. And we can see we just have a basic winter tree. If we take a look in the OpenGL, we can still see those leaves showing up. If we go back into the material for this maple leaf, we can change this to procedural color and load in a color map. And I'm just going to use one of the asileFX color map from our collection. Solid colors. Basically, we could just use a light color or a white, anything close to white. Edit that color map, change it to white, and really this isn't affecting anything except our OpenGL preview. Since we still have some of our settings in our function, which we can see our transparency map is still in there, if we edit our function and just delete those different settings, it'll now correctly show up in our OpenGL preview. And then if we open our plant in the plant editor, we're going to take our length and width and just remove those completely, bring them down to -100, click OK. So now our OpenGL preview is really more of just the branches that we want to see, and we don't need to worry about those polygons rendering either way because of the surface. So that's one way we could use this type of tree. So let's just go ahead and start out with this, and then we'll focus on the large dead tree or the other dead tree that we have available. One thing I want to do to this tree before we go ahead and populate it is just make some modifications. Because we're going to have icicles on these branches, we need to simulate that sort of weight. And we just need to droop this down a little. We can gnarl it a little bit. And I do want to increase the diameter of our branches and trunk, just to give us a little more surface area, because if the branches are too thin, we're not going to be able to see those icicles on it. Although technically we can still use a painted ecosystem and paint directly onto the object, which with each of those icicles, and be a lot more precise about how we want it to look. And I'm going to stick with our default bark surface that we have just for the time being. We could always switch that out a little bit later, something a little more realistic. We'll go ahead and open up that maple trunk, and I want to rename this in case we bring in any other types of trees into the scene. We want to make sure we have separate names for our materials, and that way there's no conflicts. So I'm going to call this maple trunk icicles. We're going to change this to an ecosystem, so that way we have an ecosystem layer. Go to add object, and now we can add in the object of our icicle objects that we have created before. So you'll need to add in the library if you haven't done so already. I already had it loaded in with the asileFX folder. But let's start out with just that imported object we created within Lightwave. And now what we can do is just hit populate to begin with. And once we've done that, we can see that we have some extremely large icicles on our plant. And what we'll need to do is scale that down, which is why we made sure that we were using the object standard material And we can see a couple of other problems with this too. Mainly, our icicles are showing up above our surface, and really where we don't want them. And we can really easily modify this. If we go to our Density tab, what we can do is set our below surface amount. So right now, we're at 0 meters, which is going to basically have the bottom of our icicle being created where the top of it should be. So we can just move this below surface amount and repopulate until we get to a point where they're in the correct place. And now our scaling, because of this, can also affect the overall placement of these icicles. I'm going to also reduce our density. And we can see that we also have icicles being created on the trunk, and that may not necessarily be where we want some of these icicles to show up. So we can go to the Environment tab and adjust our slope range. And that way we can only populate these on flat surfaces and not on the trunk of the tree. So that's something that can look a little bit better. Just bringing in that bottom slope range to 0.3. Click OK. And now we have a lot of icicles showing up on this tree. So let's go ahead and just render this out and take a look at how this tree looks. Now we can see that right now it looks pretty good. There are a few things we will need to edit though. One thing you might notice is that they're not all really falling straight down. They're a little jittered, and we have some of the icicles that are not being connected. Mainly that has to do with our scale variation, and sometimes that's just a problem you're going to run into. Of course, with the material we're going to be working on for the bark of this tree, that's going to help us blend this in together a little bit more. We could also increase the scale of these icicles a little bit more, reduce the density, so we don't have as much coverage. But first let's take a look at just making sure that all of these icicles appear straight. So we'll go back into the material for that bark. We're going to go to Scale and Orientation. And what we want to do is we have the direction from surface, and we want to make sure this is set to 0, which is going to be vertical. Repopulate, and now all of our icicles will be falling straight down. Looks a little bit better. Go back to the General tab, and I'm going to pretty much double the size of our icicles, which might be a little bit too much. Let's type in a value of 1.5, repopulate, so a little bit bigger. I'll reduce our density, click OK. Because that size is now changed, we will need to reduce the below surface amount, and we could also use proportional to the size of the instance. Going below our surface, and that's going to help fix some of the variations we have where some of them are not connected and some of them are going over the surface. So if we use proportional to the size of the instance, then if it's a smaller icicle, it'll only go down a little bit, where the larger ones will go down below the surface even more. And now we can see that pretty much all of our icicles are now connected properly. And it looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and render out another version of this. And we can see that this looks really nice. One thing we might want to do is bring that below surface amount down a little bit more, just because they are still sticking out above the surface quite a ways more than is realistic. So we can always modify that. And another thing we can do too is, instead of using individual icicles, we could model some variations that are little clusters. And keep in mind that you can also use different objects and different types of icicle models on your tree, and the more variations you create, the more realistic it's going to look. We're also going to be modifying the texture we have on this bark to make it look more realistic, I'm going to go back to that below surface amount and repopulate to make that more realistic looking. And now if we select our underlying material, which is our bottom layer in the original surface, I'm just going to load in one of the asileFX bark textures, and we'll just use something available in that pack, which is available through our site, and also a lot of these are available on the Cornucopia 3D site. Choose our bark furrowed 2. I'm going to go ahead and just include one of these bark textures with the tutorial, and that way you'll be able to use it for your own scene. And now the way these are created is by having 2 separate layers of different textures and then a variation between the 2 in their distribution, and that way it removes the tiling effect that can be caused by using image mapped materials, and we can see that distribution right here. Whether or not you want to use that for the tree is really up to you, but one thing I may need to do for this scene is just increase our ambient amount on each of the layers a little bit higher. So it's just a little brighter, and we might even need to adjust the scale of that bark texture. So I'm going to zoom in just to the trunk of our tree so we can take a look specifically at the material of the bark and figure out if we need to increase the scale or not. And overall I think the size looks pretty good, but I am going to increase the scale just a little bit more so that farther away we can see that bark texture a little bit better. So we'll go ahead and open up our surface, and for that bark material we can just increase the overall scale for our mixed material. I'm going to go ahead and increase that to 1.3 just to make it a little bit larger, but not with a huge significant difference. And I'm also going to go back and just decrease the scale of those icicles down to 1.3 because some of them might be a little too large. Actually, we'll bring that down to 1.2. And if we go to our scaling and orientation, what we can also do is make them non-uniform and adjust our overall variations between the size of the icicles, and make them very non-uniform, and adjust our size variation mainly on the Z. Do we want to have some of them very long, very short? So we'll take our size variation and actually bring it down to 0.4 to make some of them smaller. Maybe a little lower. But right now it still looks a little too uniform, so maybe we'll do the opposite effect and make them longer, and then if we need to, decrease the overall size of these icicles. So we'll bring that up to a value of 2. Now we have some very long ones and some very short ones. 1.5, a little more uniform, and then we'll bring our scale down to 1.11. Click OK. If we need to, decrease the density. Another thing we could do is if we want to just have icicles on one side of the tree, if we go back to our material in that ecosystem layer, in the environment tab, we can have an orientation constraint. And this way we can set up a preferred orientation, and the degree amount is basically which side of the tree we want to populate these on, and then the tightness is how much we just want them constrained to that area. So let's go ahead and just bring up those values a little. Really increase that tightness, and now we only have them really showing up on one side of the tree. Change the orientation. Now they're really only showing up on another side. So that's just a little more you can do to adjust that variation. And sometimes that can be a little more realistic. And then your fuzziness amount will basically be kind of the gradient and the blend between the areas that are not populated and then you'll have less icicles to a point where there's none at all in a specific angle of that tree. So let's go ahead and render this out. And that looks pretty good. We've got a very realistic looking icicle covered tree. Of course, one thing we'll want to do is add a little bit of snow to that tree as well. And mainly we'll be adding that to the tops of our branches. Because of course we wouldn't just have icicles hanging from our branches, we would also have a little bit of snow coverage.